Meet Violet, a woman whose life shattered after one explosive evening. She tried to support her husband's boss at a corporate event, but instead of gratitude, she was met with a shocking response. Her husband publicly announced their breakup. Within days, Violet found herself abandoned by family, friends, and all support, ending up in a shelter and struggling to survive. Why did her own parents turn away from her? Why are her friends watching her downfall from the sidelines? Discover how a casual conversation spiraled into a chain of events that turned into a full-blown drama. This is a story of betrayal, pride, and a fall from which there's no escape. Hey, viewer, and while you're listening to this story, don't forget to put your powerful like and subscribe to the channel.
At a recent office event, I found myself in a heated debate supporting my husband's boss, which provoked an explosive reaction from him. He abruptly stood up and declared that our relationship was over. Hello, Reddit! This is my first time sharing here, but I've been a long-time lurker, absorbing various stories and advice. I never expected to reveal my own experiences, yet here I am. I created this account for anonymity, as some of my friends might stumble upon it, and I'd prefer to keep my situation private, especially since they advised me against discussing my issues online. Recently, my husband Daniel and I have been dealing with a serious conflict, and now he's considering divorce. This outcome is the last thing I want. I deeply care about him, but it feels like everything has spiraled out of control, and I don't know how to mend the rift. I understand his anger, but I firmly believe that our 10-year marriage shouldn't end over this incident. I'm reaching out for help, hoping someone here might offer advice on the next steps. A bit about myself. I'm Violet, 35 years old, and my husband Daniel is the same age. We've been married for 10 years, but our relationship began in high school, making him a significant part of my life for as long as I can remember. We started dating shortly after graduation, and it always seemed like we were walking through life together. We were one of those couples others admired, the classic high school sweethearts who made every effort to maintain their bond. But like any other marriage, we have our flaws. We've faced challenges, including disagreements and misunderstandings, but we always managed to reconcile, until now. Looking back, I realize our issues began with Daniel's new boss. Daniel recently started working under him, and he was unhappy from the start. He felt that his boss was entirely unfit for the role, and it was a clear case of nepotism. It seemed that this man got his position thanks to his connections with the company owner, not because of his actual qualifications. This perceived unfairness fueled Daniel's resentment. He felt overwhelmed, not only managing his own responsibilities, but also compensating for his boss's shortcomings. I could feel the weight of this pressure on him, and while I empathized with his struggles, I also became increasingly curious about the source of his troubles. I found myself wanting to learn more about this person who seemed to be making Daniel's work life so difficult. The more Daniel voiced his grievances, the more I wanted to know about this boss. Who was he? What kind of person could stir up such frustration simply due to his connections? I felt a mix of frustration on Daniel's behalf and a strange desire to see this infamous figure. Maybe it was just painful curiosity, but I needed to meet this boss. When I finally met him at a work event, everything changed for me. I expected to see someone obnoxious or pathetic, a person I would instantly dislike, just like Daniel did. To my surprise, he was nothing like that. Though he might have been unqualified and used connections to his advantage, he had a charisma that was hard to resist. His presence filled the room. It felt like he was speaking only to me, despite the crowd around us. He was intelligent, attractive, and exuded a confidence that was almost intoxicating. Against my better judgment, I found myself developing a slight crush. I convinced myself it was harmless, or at least I hoped it was. However, I've never been good at hiding my emotions. When I'm drawn to someone, it usually shows in my expressions and conversations. I began casually mentioning how impressive my husband's boss was during our discussions, not just occasionally, but almost constantly. I'd say things like, "You should aim to be more like your boss. He's naturally charming and always seems so composed." I could see that my comments annoyed Daniel, but I rationalized it by telling myself he was lucky to work under someone like that. Then came the work events, Every opportunity to see Daniel's boss felt exciting. I tried to look my best, even at informal office gatherings, putting extra effort into my appearance as if preparing for a special occasion. Naturally, Daniel noticed. Several times he asked why I was dressing up so much, but I brushed it off, claiming I wanted to make a good impression on his colleagues. I insisted it was for his benefit, so people at his workplace would think well of us. I couldn't admit that it was about something more than that. Daniel returned home exhausted, venting about his boss with a blend of frustration and anger. In the past, I had always supported him, sharing his feelings of injustice and irritation. But gradually, my perspective began to shift. With each passing day, I found myself increasingly defending his boss whenever Daniel aired his complaints. I started steering away from any negative criticism aimed at this man. Whether we were alone or among friends, I would interject, suggesting that Daniel was being overly sensitive or that his boss was simply a decent person doing his job. I reminded him how fortunate he was to have such a supervisor, a remark that clearly struck a nerve. Yet, I couldn't shake the overwhelming urge to speak up. It felt as though I had to shield his boss from any criticism. This pattern deepened. I became more attentive to his boss's actions than to Daniel's feelings and struggles. When Daniel described his day, I focused on his boss, ignoring the support Daniel needed in his own challenges. I asked about his boss's responsibilities and achievements, even when it was obvious Daniel just wanted someone to listen. Daniel likely sensed that my concerns seemed more directed toward his boss than him. I even sought out opportunities to interact with his boss whenever I could. These interactions weren't merely incidental. My body language often betrayed my intentions, even if I wasn't fully conscious of it at the time. I leaned in closer when he spoke, hanging on to his every word as if they held some profound insight. I laughed at his jokes, regardless of their quality, to make him feel I was fully engaged. I found subtle ways to make physical contact, like placing my hand on his arm during conversations, or lightly touching his shoulder to get his attention. These gestures were discreet but consistent, signaling all the tiny signs of interest. At social events, I sought out moments to talk with him, sometimes even doing so right in front of Daniel and his colleagues. My behavior with his boss was far too forward, crossing boundaries that I probably should not have crossed. I called him by his first name, even when others stuck with a more formal surname. I shared inside jokes that had no place in our professional relationship. These were small things, like referencing amusing moments we had shared in previous encounters, things only he and I understood. While these exchanges might have seemed harmless to those around us, I could tell they unsettled Daniel. Despite his discomfort, I continued. The most troubling aspect was how I seemed to disregard Daniel in the process. It was as if he faded from existence whenever his boss entered the scene. My attention was wholly fixated on his boss's words and actions, and I barely noticed Daniel's presence. If he tried to engage with me or join in a joke, I dismissed him without a second thought. I behaved as if Daniel didn't exist, lost in my fascination with his boss. I left him to fend for himself, fully aware that my actions were hurting him, yet too absorbed in my infatuation to care. It's hard to explain, but it felt as though Daniel had become invisible. I was trapped in a bubble where only his boss mattered, and everyone else faded into the background. My obsession clouded my ability to see the damage I was causing, or to empathize with the pain Daniel must have felt watching my behavior unfold. I never stopped to think about how I might appear to others, especially in public or around his friends and colleagues. It was as if I were under a spell, and Daniel became secondary to me. Deep down, I knew what I was doing was wrong, but could I truly be blamed? Attraction isn't a choice. It just happens. I never intended to fall for his boss. It was simply beyond my control. The more I tried to suppress these feelings, the stronger they grew. What had started as a fleeting attraction, a passing interest, was becoming something I found increasingly difficult to hide. I realized I was infatuated with him, yet it didn't feel like a problem. At least, not my problem. I felt justified, believing I hadn't asked for this situation. It had all started innocently enough, or so I told myself. I began searching for his boss on social media, hoping to learn more about him beyond the workplace. I quickly realized that I was paying excessive attention to his social media activity, well beyond what could be considered normal. Every post he made, every photo he uploaded, and every achievement he shared drew my attention, and I eagerly liked each one. I would enthusiastically forward his travel photos to Daniel, marveling at how enviable my boss's life seemed. I found myself admiring his updates as if he were a celebrity, often mentioning his accomplishments as frequently as I would those of my own husband. I can only imagine what Daniel must have felt watching this behavior, but at the time I saw no issue with it. If he ever hinted that my fascination seemed a bit odd, I would laugh it off, insisting that I was just being friendly, as if my interest was completely innocent. Eventually, my interest spilled over from social media into real life. I began inventing reasons to reach out to my boss directly, even when there wasn't a clear purpose. I would send him simple greetings, convinced that it would lead to nothing significant. But when he responded positively, a thrill would stir within me, as if I had stumbled upon a new opportunity. Soon, I started sending him memes, discussing work ideas, and casually asking about small details that didn't really warrant his attention. This quickly became a routine in my life. I kept reassuring myself that it was all lighthearted, but deep down, I knew it was more than just friendly interaction. I told myself it was harmless. Yet soon enough, merely following his posts or exchanging small talk wasn't enough. I craved to know everything about him, his favorite foods, hobbies, childhood stories, even the mundane details that most people ignored. I found myself bombarding Daniel with questions, hoping to extract more information about his boss. If Daniel didn't know something, I thought I could easily find it out in our conversations. After all, since I was already in contact with his boss, why not take advantage of that connection? Admittedly, I'm ashamed to admit this, but looking back, I realize I probably mentioned my boss more often than I mentioned Daniel. I slipped his name into our everyday conversations as though he were a central figure in our lives, someone I couldn't help but think about, and, frankly, that was entirely true. I sensed that my obsession made Daniel uncomfortable. It was visible in his expressions and body language. Nevertheless, I brushed it off, insisting that he was overreacting and misinterpreting the situation. I understand that this may sound like an excuse, but I genuinely felt overwhelmed by my emotions. Can anyone truly control their feelings? Is it fair to judge me for this? While I can admit that I wasn't the most attentive partner, I sincerely believed I was doing nothing wrong. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Honestly, I think my unwillingness to take his concerns seriously is what ultimately pushed Daniel to his breaking point. Each time he tried to express his feelings, I would consistently shut him down. If he pointed out my intense focus on his boss, I would laugh and claim he was exaggerating. If he shared his work struggles, I dismissed his worries, insisting he just needed to push himself, like his boss did. Every time he wanted to speak his mind, I responded by praising his boss, claiming that he was a natural leader who genuinely wanted Daniel to succeed, implying that Daniel was overreacting. I regarded his boss as an almost flawless person, beyond reproach, and anyone who disagreed, including Daniel, was simply being unreasonable. Looking back, I can see how that must have frustrated him. He was opening up to me about his frustrations and how unfair things were for him at work, and I belittled his experiences. To me, his boss was an admirable figure, while Daniel was just Daniel. I made him feel as if his concerns were trivial, suggesting he was blowing the issue out of proportion. He would express stress about his boss, and I would change the subject, making him feel responsible for his emotions rather than holding his boss accountable. Yes, I know now that it was wrong. I should have been more empathetic and caring towards Daniel's feelings. But was it entirely my fault? Can anyone really control who they're drawn to? Emotions are complex and not something one can simply turn off. Maybe it's selfish, and perhaps I'll face judgment for it, but ultimately, I was just following my heart. And at the time, I didn't think I was hurting anyone, did I? I acknowledge that I made a mistake, but is it fair to say I deserve all the blame? My emotions, those are beyond my control. I regret having developed feelings for someone else, even though I never intended to. At this point, my feelings had grown so intense that I could no longer hide them. Then came the office party, where everything started to fall apart. Looking back on that night, I realize I crossed a line. I spent the evening practically idolizing Daniel's boss. Every time someone mentioned Daniel or his achievements, I instinctively redirected the focus to his superior. I showered him with praise, laughed at his jokes, perhaps more than was appropriate. It was as if I were in a trance, drawn like a moth to a flame. I was acutely aware that Daniel was watching me the entire evening. His irritation and disappointment were palpable. I brushed it off, thinking he'd bring it up later when we were alone. So I was genuinely shocked when he confronted me in front of everyone. It happened during a group conversation where Daniel and his boss disagreed on a work-related issue. Honestly, I can barely recall the details of their argument because all my attention was focused on supporting his boss. It felt automatic. Of course, I would defend him. Perhaps I was overly enthusiastic, siding with him more out of admiration than genuine interest in the points being debated. But so what? Don't I have the right to support anyone I choose? Does it truly matter if that person happens to be my husband's boss? For Daniel, this seemed to be the final straw. Seeing my open admiration for his boss while I disagreed with him must have been unbearable. He looked at me with disbelief, and I felt the tension rising. Then, something unexpected happened. In a fit of anger, Daniel stood up, glared at me, and loudly declared that it was over. Just like that, it felt like a slap. My heart dropped. Surrounded by friends, colleagues, and his boss, Daniel chose this moment to make a scene. I tried to downplay it, insisting he was overreacting as he often did. I urged him to discuss it privately later. Sure, I might have crossed a line, but there was no need to air our grievances so publicly. All I wanted was for him to calm down so we could step aside and have a reasonable discussion. But he refused to relent. He stormed out, leaving me there to maintain my composure amid the shocked and uncomfortable glances of everyone around. A wave of frustration washed over me. I couldn't believe he would humiliate me like that in front of others. I understood I may have gone too far, but his reaction? Such a public display? It caught me off guard. I never thought he would confront me in front of everyone when we could have resolved it privately. Isn't that what married couples do? Settle their disputes behind closed doors rather than causing a scene in public? I'm not sure anymore. Maybe he was truly overreacting. Maybe he had every reason to be upset. Still, I didn't deserve that level of humiliation. When Daniel walked out, I was left stranded at the party with no way to get home. And I was furious. I knew he was angry, perhaps more than ever. But did that justify leaving me there in front of everyone? I recognized that I might have been a bit too enthusiastic in my admiration for his boss, and that supporting him so publicly wasn't my best decision. But this? Leaving me in front of everyone? Feeling humiliated and alone? It felt immature, as if he were trying to teach me a lesson. After he left, I lingered for a few moments, trying to collect myself. I thought that if I acted as if nothing had happened, the situation would settle, and the awkwardness would fade. But the silence was deafening, and everyone deliberately avoided eye contact with me. It seemed that everyone around me was expecting me to leave, almost wishing for me to disappear completely. Sensing the unspoken signals, I hoped that his boss might be generous enough to give me a ride home. After all, I had been his biggest supporter all evening, cheering him on like a devoted fan. Feeling lighthearted, I thought asking him would be easy. To my surprise, he flatly refused. He offered no explanation, just said he couldn't help, and it came across as quite disrespectful. I had spent the night lifting his spirits, yet when I finally asked for help, he showed no willingness to return the favor. I was flooded with disappointment. I briefly considered calling a cab, but that plan quickly crumbled. I was met with a series of cancellations, only adding to my frustration. After staring at the app, saying driver canceled several times for about 5 minutes, I decided to abandon that idea. I felt utterly abandoned and humiliated, while everyone around me either ignored my situation or intentionally distanced themselves. In a desperate attempt, I turned to Daniel's colleagues, hoping someone might come to my aid. Yet one by one, they made excuses. I'm headed in a different direction, my car is already full, or even, my partner wouldn't feel comfortable. They didn't even look at me as they refused, making me feel like an outcast. It was hard to grasp. These were people I'd interacted with at various office events, yet they treated me like a complete stranger. After what felt like an eternity of rejections, someone finally agreed to give me a ride, but only after I'd asked nearly everyone in the room. As if the humiliation at the party wasn't enough, Daniel worsened the situation once we got home. I hoped that behind closed doors, the tension would ease. I was prepared for a tough conversation, maybe some hurt feelings, but nothing irreparable. I approached him, thinking we could discuss it calmly. I expressed regret if he felt offended or embarrassed, suggesting he might be overreacting, and assured him I never wanted the evening to end up like this. I genuinely tried to diffuse the situation, hoping he'd understand that things weren't as catastrophic as he thought. Instead, he erupted in anger. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was an intense outpouring of emotions I'd never seen from him before. He yelled and paced around the room, unable to even look at me, and it was agonizing. It became one of the worst arguments we'd ever had, with his furious accusations of betrayal, disrespect, and disbelief that I could put him in such a position. It left me completely drained. Then he did something I could never have expected. He threw me out, in the dead of night. At first, I thought he was joking, even laughed, hoping he'd realize how absurd it was. But he was deadly serious. I tried to reason with him, to calm his anger, but he shut down. He insisted I couldn't take the car, claiming it was his by right since he had paid for it. Fine, I thought, whatever. I decided to call an Uber, figuring I could just leave and come back the next day once he'd cooled down. I thought we could then have a rational conversation, but things only got worse. I headed to my parents', assuming I'd at least have a place to stay for the night. However, when I arrived, they wouldn't let me in. Daniel had already reached out to them, and to complicate matters, he accused me of infidelity. He didn't even clarify that it was, at most, an emotional connection. My parents, devout Christians and staunch Catholics who viewed divorce and infidelity as unforgivable, immediately took his side. They didn't even want to hear my version. Their advice was to go back to Daniel, make amends, and resolve our issues as adults, as if that were a realistic solution. I was consumed by rage, feeling utterly betrayed. Sitting alone, humiliated, I struggled with the reality that even my own parents had turned their backs on me. With no other options, I reached out to my closest friend, who kindly offered me a place to stay. That first night was far from peaceful. I tossed and turned, grappling with the overwhelming realization of how catastrophically my life had spiraled out of control. The next day, I confided in my friend about my ordeal, and he was visibly shocked by the depth of my situation. Thankfully, he was incredibly supportive, allowing me to stay and doing everything he could to help me get back on my feet. Still, I felt completely lost. Daniel refused to let me return home, and my parents insisted I reconcile with him first. I felt entirely alone, as if no one could understand my point of view. I acknowledged that I had crossed certain lines, but never anticipated that it would lead to such drastic consequences. The whole situation was both frustrating and humiliating, and I desperately needed a safe space to express my feelings. If anyone has advice on how I might approach Daniel, I would be deeply grateful. I'm even considering reaching out to his supervisor for help, though I'm unsure if that might make things even more complicated. At this point, I just long for a return to normalcy, for Daniel to see that our marriage is worth more than this conflict. Please, if anyone has suggestions, I truly need assistance. Update. Hello, Reddit. First, I want to clarify that my goal in this post isn't to invite criticism. I came here for advice and maybe a little empathy, not for a barrage of harsh comments calling me selfish or indifferent. I am not a narcissist, nor am I someone who ignores her husband's feelings. I shared my story as a reasonable, responsible individual seeking support and understanding. I fully acknowledge my role in this situation and admitted in my original post that I made mistakes. However, I am exhausted by the constant insistence that I am solely to blame. Daniel has always had a tendency to overreact. His emotional volatility and quick temper shouldn't surprise anyone who knows him. As for the advice I received, it's been incredibly disheartening. Suggestions like hiring a lawyer, forgiving him, or letting Daniel proceed with the divorce only added to my distress. Ironically, it seems your negative reaction worked as you intended. My friend discovered my post and shared it with others. Despite my efforts to remain anonymous by using a temporary account, someone recognized the situation and contacted me, mentioning how familiar it seemed. I was horrified. I begged them not to tell Daniel and to let me handle it on my own. Naturally, they ignored my plea and informed him. Shortly after, Daniel confronted me and asked if I had written the post. I tried to deny it, but it was futile. I hadn't even changed many details except for our names, so it didn't take him long to piece everything together. What happened next was completely unexpected. He revealed that he had been considering reconciliation, that he was open to the possibility of couples therapy or counseling. He was willing to work on our relationship. However, after reading the comments on my post and reflecting on my words, he changed his mind. He concluded that some issues might be irreparable and that certain forms of disrespect were intolerable. He said we would be divorcing and that he would contact a lawyer to initiate the process. His tone was eerily detached. He stated that any further communication would go through his attorney. Speaking with him felt like talking to a stranger, and it struck me like a physical blow. He went on to explain how my post changed his perception of me, revealing a side of me that he didn't like. He accused me of seeming self-centered, saying that I never showed genuine remorse and constantly tried to downplay my actions by shifting the blame onto him. He pointed out that I hadn't taken full responsibility and hadn't shown sincere sorrow, labeling my behavior as selfish and narcissistic. Then he delivered the final crushing blow. He said he wasn't sure he ever truly knew me. Maybe he'd been too enchanted to see my real nature, or perhaps I'd become someone he could no longer recognize. Hearing that left me completely speechless. It's hard to describe the weight of such a revelation. Well, this is the end, period. He'll have to face the consequences of his choices. I have no doubt that he'll start to regret them. It might take him months or even years, but eventually he'll realize he was wrong. And when that moment comes, if he wants to come back to me, I won't be there to welcome him. He lacks emotional maturity, and I've already invested too much time in him. So well done, Daniel. I hope you're proud of yourself. As for my circumstances, let's just say they're far from ideal. Right now, I'm living in a homeless shelter. Go ahead, laugh if you want. I know some people might call it karma, and I've seen comments like that. But who really knows the truth? Maybe these are just temporary hardships before better days come. I still believe there's a chance for a turnaround, and when that happens, I'll be sure to let everyone know. If you're curious about how I ended up in this situation, my aunt kicked me out. She accused me of stealing money. Yes, I took a little, but I was going to put it back before she even noticed it was missing. In a panic, she decided to throw me out. Honestly, I'm not that upset about it. She was unbearable, and her husband was incredibly odd. To be honest, I didn't enjoy living there, so it's not that important. Now here I am in the shelter. It's not the best place, but I'm managing. I'm planning to start looking for a job soon to see what opportunities come up. Worst case, I could end up on the streets. But I don't see it as a disaster. On top of everything, my parents have completely disowned me. They cut off all communication and refuse to acknowledge my existence. It's frankly absurd. But if they're not going to help me, why do I need them in my life? They were never supportive, so I'm better off without them. So there you go. An update. I can only imagine how my so-called friends are enjoying the spectacle, watching from a distance like vultures. They were never real friends, just a group of Daniel's followers. So enjoy the show while it lasts.
My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.